A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine you are looking at a high-resolution satellite map of the Middle East, the kind where you can see every ridge of the Sinai and every bend of the Euphrates. Now, imagine taking a digital pen and trying to trace a border based on a 3,000-year-old text. It sounds like a straightforward mapping exercise, but the moment you put pen to screen, you realize the lines start shifting depending on which chapter you are reading.
It is a massive cartographic puzzle, Corn. And honestly, it is one of the most intellectually stimulating ways to look at geography because it forces you to reconcile ancient topographical descriptions with modern geopolitical realities. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way, and I have been neck-deep in regional surveys and GIS overlays all morning because of this.
Well, I hope you brought your compass, Herman, because today's prompt from Daniel is a deep dive into exactly that. He wants us to map the biblical boundaries of the land of Israel against modern political borders. It is a fascinating prompt because Daniel is essentially asking us to do a technical translation of ancient landmarks into modern coordinates. And before we get into the weeds of the Wadi El-Arish, a quick shout out to Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is actually powering the script for our deep dive today.
I love that we are using cutting-edge AI to parse texts that were originally written on parchment. It is a great juxtaposition. Now, to kick this off, we have to address the elephant in the room. The Bible does not actually give one single static map. Depending on whether you are looking at the covenant with Abraham in Genesis, the tribal allocations in Joshua, or the prophetic vision in Ezekiel, the land of Israel, can look very different.
Right. It is not a one-size-fits-all border. You have the Promised Land as a broad theological concept, and then you have the Conquered Land, which is what was actually settled. It is like the difference between a company's 5-year growth plan and its actual quarterly footprint.
That is a fair way to put it. If we look at the most expansive definition, often cited from Genesis 15 verse 18, the text mentions the territory from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. If you take that literally and use the most common historical interpretations, you are looking at a massive swath of the modern Middle East. We are talking about modern-day Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, large portions of Syria, Jordan, and even segments of Iraq and Egypt.
See, that is where the technical debate starts getting spicy. The river of Egypt. If you ask a casual reader, they might say, "Oh, that is the Nile." But if you look at the geography and the Hebrew term, Nakal Mitzrayim, most scholars and geographers argue it is something else entirely.
Well, not exactly, but you hit on the core debate. Nachal typically refers to a wadi, a seasonal stream, or a dry riverbed that fills with water during the rainy season. The Nile is almost always referred to as Yeor. So, most geographers point to Wadi El-Arish in the Sinai Peninsula. If you map Wadi El-Arish as the southern border, the biblical boundary cuts right through the middle of the Sinai, which is currently Egyptian sovereign territory.
It is a huge difference. If it is the Nile, the border is at Cairo. If it is Wadi El-Arish, the border is about 90 miles west of the modern Gaza, Egypt border. That is a lot of sand and a lot of different political implications. Why the ambiguity? Is it just the passage of time? Or were the landmarks themselves shifting?
It is more about the nature of ancient landmarks. They used what was permanent to them, mountains, rivers, and seas. But a wadi can be a bit of a moving target over millennia due to erosion or changing weather patterns. However, Wadi El-Arish is a massive drainage system. When you look at it on a satellite map, it is unmistakable. It carves a clear path from the heart of the Sinai up to the Mediterranean.
Okay, so if we take the Wadi El-Arish as the southern anchor, Let's move north. The Euphrates is mentioned as the eastern or northeastern limit. That is a long way from Jerusalem. If you draw a line from the Sinai to the Euphrates, you are essentially swallowing up almost all of modern-day Jordan and a huge chunk of the Syrian desert.
It is significant, and this is where we see the difference between the borders of the patriarchs and the borders of the coming out of Egypt, described in the book of Numbers, chapter 34. Numbers 34 is actually the most detailed surveyor's report in the entire Bible. It gives a step-by-step boundary description that feels much more like a legal deed than a poetic promise.
Let's break down that Numbers 34 map then. That feels like the tentacle specs Daniel is looking for. Where does it start?
It starts in the south, at the wilderness of Zin. If you map that today, you are looking at the southern Negev desert. It then moves along the border of Edom, modern southern Jordan, and heads toward the Dead Sea. From the southern tip of the Dead Sea, it goes down past Ma'ale Akrabim, which is still a recognizable geographical feature in the Negev today, and then out toward Kadesh Barnea.
Kadesh Barnea is a famous one. We actually have a pretty good idea where that is, right? Near the modern border between Israel and Egypt.
It is generally identified with Tel el-Kudirat in the eastern Sinai. So, again, the biblical border pushes slightly west of the modern international border. Then the text says it goes to Hazar Adar and Asmon and finally reaches the Brook of Egypt, the Wadi El-Arish again, and ends at the sea. So the southern border in Numbers is basically a line from the southern Dead Sea across the Negev into the Sinai and out to the Mediterranean.
So, compared to modern Israel, that southern border is actually fairly close, just shifted a bit into the Sinai. But what about the north? Because that is where things get really expansive and, frankly, a bit more confusing for modern readers.
The northern border in Numbers 34 is a fascinating exercise in historical geography. It says the border goes from the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, to Mount Hor. Now, this is not the Mount Hor near Petra, where Aaron is buried. This is a northern Mount Hor. Most scholars identify this with the peaks of the Lebanon Range, or perhaps Mount Hermon.
Mount Hermon is the big one today, where the borders of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria meet. But the text goes further, right? It mentions Lebo-Hamath.
Lebo-Hamath is the crucial waypoint. For a long time, people thought it just meant the entrance to Hamath, like a general direction. But modern archaeology and linguistic study suggest it was a specific city, modern-day Labwa in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. If you plot Labwa on a map, you realize the biblical northern border extends significantly further north than the modern Litani River or the Blue Line that separates Israel and Lebanon today.
We're talking about a border that would include a large portion of the Lebanese coast and the Bekaa Valley. That is a massive departure from the modern political map. Why does that matter for someone looking at this today?
It matters because it shows that the historical religious conception of the land was not based on modern Westphalian nation-state ideas. It was based on topographical basins and natural gateways. Lebo-Hamath is a natural pass. It is where the mountains open up. To an ancient traveler, that was the logical place for a border to be because it was a controllable geographic choke point.
It is interesting that you call it a choke point. Even 3,000 years ago, they were thinking like military engineers. If you control the pass, you control the land. Now, if we move from Lebanon toward the east, where does the line go?
From Lebo-Hamath, the text in Numbers says it goes to Zedad and Ziphron and ends at Hazar Enon. These are likely locations on the eastern slopes of the anti-Lebanon mountains, moving toward the Syrian desert. Then it descends along the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, the Chinnereth, and follows the Jordan River down to the Dead Sea.
Wait, so in the Numbers 34 version, the eastern border is the Jordan River. That sounds a lot like the modern border between Israel and the Kingdom of Jordan.
In that specific chapter, yes. It defines the land Canaan as being primarily west of the Jordan. But, and this is a big but, we know from the rest of the text that 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, settled on the eastern side of the Jordan, in what is now the modern state of Jordan and the Golan Heights. So the land of Israel, as an inhabited reality, included the East Bank, even if the land of Canaan, as a formal definition, stopped at the river.
This highlights the layered nature of these maps. You have the ideal borders in Genesis, the administrative borders in Numbers, and the settlement borders in Joshua. It is like looking at a map of the United States and trying to decide if you are looking at the original 13 colonies, the Louisiana Purchase, or the current 50 states. They are all America, but the lines are different.
That is a great analogy. And if you look at the from Dan to Beersheba description that pops up later in the Bible, that is the shorthand version. It describes the core inhabited area. Dan is in the far north at the foot of Mount Hermon, and Beersheba is the gateway to the southern desert. If you map just Dan to Beersheba, you actually get a footprint that is smaller than the modern state of Israel. It leaves out the southern Negev and the Arava Valley.
So modern Israel is actually a weird hybrid. It is larger than the Dan to Beersheba core in the south, but much smaller than the Numbers 34 or Genesis 15 definitions in the north and east.
Precisely. Modern Israel's borders are the result of the 1948 War of Independence, the 1949 Armistice Agreements, and the 1967 Six-Day War. They were drawn by generals and diplomats over maps in green felt rooms, often following ceasefire lines rather than ancient watersheds. But what is wild is how often those modern lines keep bumping up against the ancient ones.
Like the Golan Heights. That was part of the tribal allotment for Manasseh, and today it is a strategic high point that Israel considers essential for its security. It is the same piece of dirt, just with a different set of justifications, one based on ancient heritage, and the other on modern artillery ranges.
And the Jordan River is still the primary security border. Even though the political border is the river, the strategic reality of that valley hasn't changed in 3 millennia. It is still the deepest land trench on Earth, and it still forms a massive natural barrier.
I want to go back to that River of Egypt thing for a second, because that feels like a place where the mapping gets really contentious. If you look at the modern border between Israel and Egypt, it is a straight line drawn by the British and the Ottomans in 1906. It literally cuts through the desert with a ruler.
That 1906 line is the definition of artificial. It was drawn to keep the Ottoman Empire away from the Suez Canal. It has almost nothing to do with the natural geography of the Sinai. The biblical border of Wadi El-Arish is a natural drainage basin. If you were an ancient king, you wouldn't draw a straight line through the sand. You would say, everything that drains into this wadi belongs to me.
It is a more organic way of thinking about territory. But if you try to apply that today, you run into the second-order effects we always talk about. If you move a border to a natural landmark like a wadi, you are suddenly dealing with water rights, flash flood management, and different sets of mineral deposits.
And that is a huge part of the research for people who study biblical geography today. They aren't just looking at old maps. They're using hydrological data. If you can prove that a certain wadi was the primary water source for a region, you can better identify why an ancient text would fix a border there. It turns the Bible into a sort of environmental history of the region.
So, for the listeners who want to visualize this, if you were to overlay the maximalist biblical map, the one from the Nile to the Euphrates, over a modern map, what are the biggest surprises for someone who only knows the current political lines?
The biggest surprise is the north. Most people don't realize that the biblical land of Israel includes a huge portion of what is now Lebanon and Syria. We aren't just talking about a few miles over the border. We are talking about territory that goes up past Beirut and halfway to Aleppo. That is a massive area that is currently part of different sovereign nations with very different political systems.
And the other surprise is the East Bank. The modern state of Jordan occupies land that was historically the heartland of several Israelite tribes. When you drive through the heights of Gilead in modern Jordan, you are driving through territory that was essentially the Midwest of ancient Israel, the breadbasket and the grazing land.
It really changes your perspective on regional stability. When people talk about historical claims, they are often looking through a very narrow window of the last 70 or 80 years. But the geography Daniel is pointing us toward has a memory that is thousands of years long.
Okay, so let's get practical for a second. If someone is listening to this and they want to go home and see this for themselves, how do they do it? You mentioned GIS, Geographic Information Systems, earlier. Is this something a regular person can explore?
Oh, absolutely. You don't need a PhD in cartography. You can use open source tools like QGIS or even just Google Earth Pro. There are amazing data sets available. The Bible Atlas Project and several academic sites have KML files. Those are the map layer files that you can just drop onto a modern satellite view.
That sounds like a great weekend project for the nerds among us. You can literally toggle the numbers 34 border on and off over a modern view of the Sinai or the Bekaa Valley.
It is the best way to understand the scale. When you see the line for Lebo-Hamath and you realize it is 200 miles north of Jerusalem, the text stops being abstract. You realize that the people writing these descriptions had a very clear, very expansive vision of their place in the world.
It also helps clarify some of the modern misconceptions we see in the news. You often hear people use the term Greater Israel as a political slur or a specific modern expansionist plan. But when you look at the maps, you realize that Greater Israel is actually a very old, very technical term used by geographers to describe these different layers of biblical borders.
That is an important distinction. There is a difference between a theological map and a political platform. For most people in the region, the modern borders are a reality they have to live with every day. But for historians and archaeologists, the biblical borders are a base layer that helps explain why certain cities were built where they were. Why is Hazor so important? Because it sits right on the highway to that northern border at Lebo-Hamath.
It is the why behind the where. I think that is the real takeaway here. The Bible isn't just a book of rules or stories. It is a GPS log of a people trying to define their space in a very crowded neighborhood. And that neighborhood hasn't gotten any less crowded in the last 3 millennia.
If anything, it has gotten more complicated because we have added more layers. We have the Roman provinces, the Byzantine themes, the Ottoman vilayets, the British Mandate, and now the modern states. It is like a geological core sample of history. But the biblical layer is the bedrock. Everything else was built on top of it.
You know, what I find wild is that we are still using the same landmarks. We are still talking about the Jordan, the Litani, the Euphrates, and the Wadi El-Arish. The names change, the flags change, but the ridges and the riverbeds are exactly where they were when the authors of Numbers were scratching this out on a scroll.
That is the permanence of geography. It is the one thing that doesn't care about politics. The Jordan River is going to keep flowing south whether there is a peace treaty or a war. The mountains of Lebanon are going to keep standing there whether they are in one country or another.
It is a grounding thought, actually. In a world of fake news and shifting narratives, a mountain range is a pretty reliable piece of data.
It really is. And I think that is why Daniel sent this prompt. He works in tech and AI where everything is virtual and fluid, but geography is the ultimate hard-coded reality. When you map these ancient lines, you are touching something that is both incredibly old and incredibly solid.
So, to recap the mapping exercise for Daniel, if you are looking at the Bible, you have to choose your layer. If you want the maximalist vision, you are looking at a Middle East, where Israel is the dominant regional footprint from Egypt to Iraq. If you want the numbers survey, you are looking at a very specific, defensible territory that includes modern Lebanon and the Sinai. And if you are looking at Dan to Beersheba, you are looking at a compact core that is even smaller than what we see on the news today.
And the aha moment is realizing that none of these maps match the modern one exactly. There are overlaps, there are gaps, and there are places where the ancient line and the modern fence are miles apart.
It makes you wonder what the map will look like in another 1,000 years. Will people be looking back at our 1949 armistice lines with the same kind of curiosity we have for the borders of the tribe of Naphtali?
Probably. Maps are just snapshots of a moment in time, but the dirt is forever, and that is why we keep digging into it, both literally and figuratively.
Well, I think we have sufficiently mapped the territory for today. It is a lot to chew on, especially when you realize how much history is packed into a single verse in Genesis or Numbers.
It really is. And for our listeners, I highly recommend doing that GIS overlay. It changes the way you read the news, and it definitely changes the way you read the text. When you can see the River of Egypt on a satellite map, it stops being a Sunday school lesson and starts being a topographical reality.
Before we wrap up, we should probably give some credit where it is due. Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the wheels on this bus. And of course, a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. Without that serverless horsepower, we'd be trying to generate these scripts on a literal scroll.
And we definitely wouldn't be able to process these GIS layers as fast.
If you found this dive into biblical cartography interesting, do us a favor and leave a review on your podcast app. It actually helps new people find the show, and it keeps us motivated to keep digging into Daniel's weirdest prompts.
You can also find all our previous episodes and the RSS feed at myweirdprompts.com. We have covered everything from the geography of the Gaza Strip to the legal status of the Golan, so there is plenty more to explore if you are into this kind of thing.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I'm Cord.
And I'm Herman Poppleberry. Thanks for listening.
See you next time. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird.